Last Call at the Driftmoon Cantina. A space western. The sky over Driftmoon was a canvas of impossible colors. Deep amber bled into violet at the horizon, where the rust-colored gas giant Terminus hung like a massive eye, perpetually watching. Its rings stretched across the heavens in delicate arcs of ice and stone, catching the light of the distant sun and scattering it into countless points of gold and silver. The light moved slowly, glacially, as if time itself had grown tired on this forgotten moon. The landing port was a skeletal thing, all exposed girders and corrugated metal panels that groaned and pinged as they cooled from the heat of the day. A dozen ships sat on their landing struts, their hulls still radiating warmth into the gathering dusk. The air shimmered above them in lazy waves. Dust hung suspended in the amber light, dancing in slow spirals as the evening wind began to stir, carrying with it the scent of ozone and hot metal, the smell of 100 departures and arrivals. The wind itself was a musician, finding the gaps and hollow spaces in the port's infrastructure. It whistled through the antenna arrays that bristled from every surface, hummed through the power cables strung between the dock towers, and sang a low, mournful note as it passed over the open cargo bays. The sound was like a harmonica playing itself, melancholy and patient, a song with no beginning and no end. High above, stars began to appear, one by one, like candles being lit in distant windows. They blinked and wavered in the thin atmosphere, ancient light traveling impossibly far to reach this small, dusty outpost on the edge of civilized space. The port lights flickered on in response, warm sodium orange against the deepening blue of twilight, casting long shadows that stretched and merged into pools of darkness. A few figures moved through the port with the unhurried pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. A maintenance worker in oil-stained coveralls checked fuel lines, their movements methodical and practiced. Two dock workers shared a cigarette beside a shipping container, the ember glowing bright orange in the gathering dark. A small cleaning drone hummed past, its brushes scraping softly against the metal deck plates, leaving a trail of clean metal in its wake. The air was growing cooler now, that particular desert moon coolness that came on fast after sunset. It carried the promise of a cold night ahead, but for now, in this liminal hour between day and dark, it was perfect, comfortable, the kind of temperature that made you grateful for where you were, even if where you were was nowhere in particular. In the distance, beyond the port's perimeter fence, the landscape stretched out in gentle undulations of rust-colored sand and dark stone. Here and there, strange formations jutted from the ground like the bones of ancient giants, their surfaces carved smooth by millennia of wind. A few hardy plants clung to life in the crevices, their silvery leaves glinting in the last light. And above it all, Terminus continued its slow rotation, its bands of ochre and burgundy swirling in storms that had raged for centuries, silent, patient, eternal. This was Driftmoon at dusk, a place of transition, of quiet endings and gentle beginnings, a place where people came to rest before moving on to wherever they were going next, a place that existed, it seemed, solely to remind travelers that even in the vast loneliness of space, there were still small pockets of stillness, of peace, of home. The ship in Bay 7 was a study in contradictions. Someone had named it the Wayward Sun, and the words were still visible on the hull beneath 3 different paint schemes, each one applied over the last without bothering to sand down to bare metal first. The result was a topography of color, patches of deep blue showing through faded red, hints of yellow beneath it all. Where the paint had flaked away entirely, the original gray hull showed through like old skin. The ship was a Sparrow-class light freighter, or at least it had been once. Now it was something else entirely. an amalgamation of modifications and repairs that had transformed it into something unique. The starboard nacelle had been replaced with a model from a completely different ship class, giving the vessel a lopsided appearance that somehow worked. Solar panels had been welded to every available surface, their dark squares catching the last light of the day. Hand-painted symbols decorated the hull near the airlock. Protective sigils and good luck charms from a dozen different cultures accumulated across years of travel. The cargo ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, and Rowan emerged into the cooling evening air. They paused at the bottom of the ramp, letting their eyes adjust to the amber light, letting their lungs adjust to air that wasn't recycled through the ship's life support. They stood there for a long moment, just breathing, just being. Rowan was somewhere in their 40s, though the years in space made it hard to tell exactly. Their face was weathered by artificial ship's air and recycled atmosphere, by too many hours staring into the black, by the particular kind of tiredness that came from a life spent always moving. They wore practical clothes, a brown leather jacket worn soft at the elbows, gray cargo pants with too many pockets, boots that had walked across the decks of 100 different stations. A faded blue bandana was tied around their neck, more habit than fashion. Their dark hair was shot through with gray, pulled back in a loose ponytail that had mostly come undone during the descent. They didn't bother to fix it. There was no one here they needed to impress. As they walked across the landing pad, their boots made a satisfying sound against the metal deck plates. Clang, clang, clang. A rhythm that felt right, that felt like arriving. Each step was deliberate, but unhurried. The pace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely helped. They carried a small duffel bag over one shoulder, light enough that it barely registered. Everything they truly needed was either on the ship or didn't exist. Rowan was a courier by trade, or that's what they told anyone who asked. They ferried packages and messages between the scattered outposts of the frontier, carried data chips and sealed containers, picked up cargo from one dusty moon and delivered it to another. Sometimes the work was legal, sometimes it occupied a grayer area, but it was always honest in its way. They'd never carried anything that kept them up at night. Well, not much anyway. Once, years ago, they'd done more dangerous work. Bounty running, they'd called it, though that made it sound more glamorous than it was. Mostly it had been long hours of waiting, brief moments of tension, and the constant low-grade stress of looking over your shoulder. They'd been good at it, good enough to stay alive when others hadn't, but they'd never loved it. When the opportunity came to step away, they'd taken it without hesitation. Now they ran small jobs, easy routes, the kind of work that paid enough to keep the ship running, and left time for long stretches in hyperspace where the only sound was the hum of the engines, and the only view was the infinite black. It was a quiet life, and Rowan had grown to love quiet. They passed through the gate in the perimeter fence, nodding to the security guard who didn't look up from her tablet. The path from the port to the cantina was well worn, packed earth that had been walked smooth by countless boots over countless years. Small lights marked the edges of the path, solar-powered LEDs that glowed a soft white in the gathering darkness. Above them, the first stars of the night were fully visible now, a magnificent sprawl of light that stretched from horizon to horizon. Rowan glanced up, automatically picking out familiar constellations, though they looked different from this angle, from this moon. The Big Dipper was there, or something like it. Orion's belt, or a reasonable facsimile. The Milky Way was a river of silver cutting across the sky. They walked on, boots crunching on the gravel at the path's edge, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift from their shoulders. Tomorrow they'd refuel, check the cargo manifest, maybe take on another small job if anything interesting came through. But tonight was not about work. Tonight was about rest, about a familiar drink in a familiar place, about being still for a few hours before the black called them back. Rowan was tired, but it was a peaceful kind of tiredness, the kind that came from a job completed, from arriving somewhere safe, from knowing that, for tonight at least, they could stop moving. The cantina was just ahead now, its windows glowing warm in the darkness, music drifting out into the night like an invitation. The Driftmoon Cantina announced itself gradually, as all good things should. First came the light spilling from its windows, warm amber rectangles glowing against the darkening sky. Then came the music, barely audible at first, growing clearer with each step, a slow saxophone melody floating on the evening air, backed by the soft brush of drums and the lazy walk of a stand-up bass. Finally came the smell, cooking oil and spices, something savory on a grill, and underneath it all, the particular scent of a place where people gathered, coffee and alcohol, tobacco and human warmth. The building itself had been constructed from salvaged ship parts, a fact that became obvious as you approached. The outer walls were made from cargo container panels, their corrugated surfaces still bearing the faded logos of shipping companies that had gone bankrupt decades ago. The roof was a patchwork of hull plates from decommissioned vessels, each one a slightly different shade of gray or silver. Where the sections met, someone had sealed the gaps with industrial sealant that had weathered to the color of old bone. But despite its cobbled-together appearance, or perhaps because of it, the cantina radiated a sense of permanence, of belonging. Someone had planted flowering vines along the base of the walls, and they'd climbed up the surface in defiance of the moon's harsh environment. Their purple blooms closed now against the cool of evening, but still adding touches of color to the weathered metal. String lights had been hung around the entrance, simple bulbs that swayed gently in the breeze, casting moving shadows across the ground. A hand-painted sign hung above the door, the Driftmoon Cantina, the letters slightly uneven but lovingly rendered in gold paint that caught and held the light. Below it, in smaller letters, all travelers welcome. Rowan pushed open the door, and a wave of warmth washed over them, both literal and metaphorical. The temperature inside was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to chase away the evening chill, but not so warm as to be uncomfortable. The transition from outside to inside felt like stepping through a membrane into another world, a better world, a world that moved at its own gentle pace. The interior was lit by what could only be described as ambient glow, no harsh overhead lights, just dozens of small sources scattered throughout the space. Candles flickered on tables, their flames dancing behind hurricane glass. Old-fashioned Edison bulbs hung on long cords from the ceiling, their filaments glowing warm gold. A string of paper lanterns, souvenirs from some festival on some long-ago planet, cast soft-colored light across one corner. The result was a space that felt simultaneously vast and intimate, a place where shadows gathered in comfortable pools and faces were softly illuminated. The bar dominated the left side of the room, a magnificent construction built from the bridge console of an old colony ship. Someone had repurposed the navigation station into a back bar, its original displays replaced with shelves of bottles that glowed like jewels in the low light. Amber whiskey, clear vodka, green absinthe, red wine. Each bottle caught and multiplied the candlelight, creating a mosaic of color and reflection. The bar top itself was polished ship's deck plating, worn smooth by years of elbows and glasses, the metal developing a patina that spoke of countless conversations, countless drinks, countless nights like this one. The cantina was perhaps 2/3 full, which seemed to be its natural state. Not crowded, not empty, but comfortably populated. People sat alone at the bar, nursing drinks and their own thoughts. Others clustered in twos and threes at the mismatched tables that filled the floor, each table different, each one salvaged from somewhere else, their variety somehow adding to the charm rather than detracting from it. Conversations happened in low voices, creating a susurrus of human sound that blended with the music. Laughter erupted occasionally from one corner or another, but it was gentle laughter, tired laughter, the kind that came at the end of a long day. Glass clinked against glass as someone set down their drink. Ice rattled in a shaker behind the bar. A chair scraped against the floor as someone stood to leave. Each sound was distinct, but also part of the whole, a symphony of small noises that together created the particular music of a place where people gathered to rest. In the far corner, an old jukebox glowed with inner light, its mechanism visible through scratched plastic panels. It was playing something slow and jazzy, a saxophone leading a conversation with a piano, neither one in any hurry to reach the end. The sound quality was imperfect. There was a gentle crackle beneath the music, the sound of analog playback, of physical media wearing out gradually over time. But the imperfection made it better somehow, more real, more human. The walls were covered in accumulated history, photos of ships, crews, people long gone to wherever people went, old navigation charts from the early days of expansion, their routes now obsolete, a mounted thruster assembly from some long-ago crash, polished and hung like a trophy. Postcards from 100 different worlds, their corners curled with age, a faded flag from a colony that no longer existed. Each item had a story, though most of those stories had been forgotten. They remained anyway, silent witnesses to the passage of time, to all the people who had stopped here on their way to somewhere else. Behind the bar stood Marcus, and if the Cantina had a heart, it was him. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and soft around the middle, with skin the color of dark oak and hair gone completely white. He moved with the economy of motion that came from doing the same tasks in the same space for years. Every gesture precise and unhurried. He was wiping down the bar with a cloth. The motion automatic. His attention on the room itself. Watching without seeming to watch. Present without being intrusive. Marcus had a gift, the kind that couldn't be taught. He remembered everyone, but he never asked questions. People came to his bar and told him things or didn't tell him things, and it was all the same to him. He listened if they wanted to talk, stayed quiet if they wanted silence, always seeming to know which was needed without being told. It was a rare skill, and it made the Cantina what it was. Not just a place to drink, but a place to be, a place to exist without explanation. The Cantina felt, in that indefinable way, like a place that existed outside of time, while the rest of the universe rushed forward, carrying people along in its current. This space remained still, unchanged, a fixed point around which everything else revolved. You could leave for a year, for 10 years, and return to find it exactly as you'd left it. The same warm light, the same slow music, the same gentle hum of quiet conversation. It was a refuge in the truest sense, not from danger but from loneliness, from the vast indifference of space, from the weight of always moving, always searching. Here, for a few hours, you could simply be. No past, no future, just the present moment and the warm amber light. Rowan stood just inside the door for a moment, letting it all wash over them. The warmth, the music, the soft sounds of human habitation. They felt something unknot in their chest, some tension they hadn't even known they were carrying finally releasing its grip. They were home, or as close to home as they'd ever found among the stars. Rowan made their way to the bar, weaving between tables with the unconscious grace of someone who'd walked this path many times before. Their boots made soft sounds on the wooden floor, real wood, brought up from somewhere at great expense, one of Marcus's few indulgences. The floor was scarred and stained from years of use, but it had been sanded smooth and oiled until it glowed warmly in the low light. Marcus looked up as they approached, and something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his eyes. He didn't say anything, just reached beneath the bar and produced a glass, clean and slightly cool to the touch. The glass caught the light as he set it down, reflecting amber and gold. From a shelf behind him, he selected a bottle without hesitation, the same bottle he always selected for Rowan, though they'd never explicitly told him what they liked. It was a whiskey from New Montana, smoky and smooth, with notes of vanilla and char, the kind of drink that went down easy but demanded to be sipped slowly, respected. Marcus poured 2 fingers, the liquid catching the light as it fell from bottle to glass. Amber becoming gold, becoming amber again. He slid the glass across the polished bar top, and Rowan caught it with easy familiarity, their fingers wrapped around the glass, feeling its coolness, its weight, its perfect solidity. "Marcus," Rowan said, by way of greeting. "Rowan," Marcus replied, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. That was all that needed to be said. Rowan raised the glass in a small salute, and Marcus nodded once, already turning his attention back to the cloth in his hands, back to the endless task of keeping the bar clean, keeping the space welcoming. Rowan took their first sip, and the whiskey bloomed across their tongue, smoke and sweetness, warmth spreading down their throat and into their chest. They closed their eyes for a moment, just feeling it, just being present with the simple pleasure of a good drink in a good place. When they opened their eyes again, they noticed someone in the corner booth, half hidden in shadow. Chen, the mechanic. They'd been there the last time Rowan passed through, and the time before that, and probably every time in between. Chen seemed to exist in a perpetual state of semi-motion, always working on something, never quite finishing. Tonight they were polishing a tool, a complicated wrench of some kind, all angles and pivot points. They worked the cloth over its surface with slow, meditative strokes, the metal gradually taking on a soft gleam in the candlelight. There was something almost ritualistic about it, the kind of maintenance that went beyond mere function into the realm of care, of respect for the tools that made life possible. Chen looked up, caught Rowan's eye, and nodded. Rowan nodded back. After a moment, Chen gestured to the empty seat across from them, an invitation without words. Rowan picked up their glass and made their way over, settling into the booth with a sigh of relief. The seat was worn smooth, the cushion compressed into the perfect shape by years of use. It felt like sitting down into a familiar embrace. "Still working on the solar flare?" Rowan asked, though they already knew the answer. Chen smiled, a rueful expression. "Always," they said. Their voice was soft, with the faint accent of someone who'd learned Standard as a second language. "She's going to fly someday. You'll see." The solar flare was Chen's project, had been their project for as long as anyone could remember. It sat in a hangar at the far end of the port, a sleek racing ship from the old days, all curves and speed. Or it had been once. Now it was mostly a skeleton, stripped down to its frame, waiting for parts that never seemed to arrive, for money that was always just out of reach. "I'm sure she will," Rowan said, and meant it. Not because they thought the ship would actually fly, They'd learned long ago not to make predictions about impossible things, but because Chen's belief in it was real, and that reality deserved respect. Got the port thruster assembly cleaned and rebuilt, Chen continued, still working the cloth over the wrench. Original parts, too. Found them in a scrapyard on Titan's second moon. Had to dig through 3 meters of sorted metal. But there they were. Exactly what I needed. They talked on like this for a while, Chen describing the work they'd done, the parts they still needed, the modifications they were planning. Rowan listened, sipping their whiskey, offering occasional comments or questions. It was a conversation they'd had before, would have again, the specifics changing but the essence remaining the same. It was comfortable, like well-worn clothes, like an old song you knew all the words to. After a while, Chen's voice trailed off, and they both sat in companionable silence, the kind that only happened between people who'd learned to be quiet together. The music from the jukebox shifted, transitioning seamlessly from saxophone to piano, the melody wandering like someone walking without destination, content to see where the path led. "You heading out soon?" Chen asked eventually. "Day or two," Rowan said. "Got a run to Kepler Station. Small cargo. Nothing complicated." Chen nodded, understanding. "Safe travels," they said. "Thanks." From somewhere across the room came the sound of strings being tuned, notes climbing and falling as they searched for the right pitch. Rowan turned to look and saw Yuki in her usual spot near the far wall, cradling an instrument that looked like no instrument Rowan had ever seen before. It had the general shape of a guitar, but wrong. All curves where there should be angles, with strings that seemed to multiply the more you looked at them. Yuki was old, though exactly how old was anyone's guess. Her hair was silver white, pulled back in a long braid that hung down past her waist. Her hands were weathered but steady as they moved across the strings, finding the right tensions, the right relationships between the notes. She began to play, and the cantina grew quieter, conversations dropping to whispers or stopping altogether, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because the music deserved it, commanded it gently. The instrument's voice was unlike anything from Earth. There were harmonics in it, overtones that seemed to come from nowhere, notes that hung in the air long after the string had stopped vibrating. The melody was simple but profound, each note given space to breathe, to exist fully before the next one arrived. It was music that understood patience, that knew the value of silence between sounds. Rowan closed their eyes and let the music wash over them. It spoke of distance and longing, of home and homelessness, of the particular solitude of space travel. It was a song everyone in the room understood without words, because they'd all felt it. That mix of freedom and isolation, of possibility and loneliness, that came with a life lived between the stars. The song stretched out, unhurried, letting each phrase develop naturally, organically. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. Time had a way of becoming slippery in the cantina, especially when Yuki played. Eventually, the final note faded into silence, hanging in the air like a question before dissipating completely. No one applauded. That wasn't the way here. Instead, people nodded, raised their glasses slightly, returned to their conversations in voices that were somehow softer, more thoughtful than before. Rowan opened their eyes and found Chen watching them with a slight smile. "She's something, isn't she?" Chen said. "Every time," Rowan agreed. They sat together a while longer, finishing their drinks, existing in the warm bubble of the cantina while outside, the universe continued its endless rotation, indifferent and vast. Later, Rowan found themselves back at the bar, their glass refilled though they couldn't remember Marcus doing it. The whiskey glowed amber in the candlelight, and they stared into it like looking into a pool of liquid time, seeing not their reflection but their history, spread out across the surface in ripples and eddies. How many jobs had there been? How many cargo runs, courier missions, occasional bounties back in the old days? They'd lost count years ago, all the individual jobs bleeding together into one long, continuous journey. But certain ones stood out, bright spots in memory, moments that had mattered for one reason or another. There was the time they'd delivered medical supplies to a colony on the edge of the Vale, racing against time as a plague spread through the settlement. They'd arrived with hours to spare, handed over the cargo, and left without waiting for thanks. The memory wasn't special because of heroism. They'd just been doing a job, one they were being paid for, but because of the look in the doctor's eyes, the pure relief, the weight of responsibility momentarily lifted. There was the long haul to Proxima Station, 3 weeks in hyperspace with nothing but the ship's library for company. They'd read their way through half of it, old novels and new ones, histories and philosophies, losing themselves in other people's words. When they'd finally emerged, they'd felt somehow larger, like their mind had stretched to fill the silence. There was the bounty that had ended their time in that line of work. A corporate thief, they'd been told, someone who'd stolen proprietary data. They'd tracked the target for 2 months, finally cornering them in a rundown hotel on Europa. But when they'd looked into the person's eyes, seen the fear there, heard the stammered explanation about exposing safety violations that were killing workers, something had shifted inside them. They'd let the target go, told their employer the trail had gone cold, and never taken another bounty contract again. How many planets had they seen? Dozens, certainly, maybe hundreds if you counted moons and stations and artificial habitats, each one different, each one the same in the ways that mattered. Humans spread across the galaxy like seeds on the wind, putting down roots wherever they landed, building homes from metal and hope. They remembered the red deserts of New Arizona, where the sand sang in the wind and the sky was the color of rust at sunset. They remembered the ice fields of Europa, kilometers thick, hiding an ocean that might contain life humans would never understand. They remembered the orbital gardens of Kepler Station, where trees grew in zero gravity, their branches reaching in all directions at once, free from the tyranny of down. They remembered the rainforests of New Sarawak, where the air was so thick with moisture you could almost swim through it, where flowers as big as your head bloomed in colors that didn't have names. They remembered the crystal caves of Titan's third moon, where the walls reflected light in impossible patterns, creating rainbows that shifted and changed as you moved through them. And the people. God, the people. They came and went like seasons, like weather, most of them brief presences who passed through Rowan's life and left barely a trace. But some lingered. Some became part of the permanent collection, faces and names that Rowan carried with them from system to system. There was Kai, the navigator they'd worked with for 2 years, who'd taught Rowan to read the stars like a language, to see patterns in the chaos of the cosmos. Kai had left to settle down on New Tahiti, bought a boat, and started taking tourists out to see the bioluminescent fish that gathered in the bay at night. Rowan still got messages sometimes, brief updates that always ended the same way. You should come visit. Maybe someday they would. There was Elena, the engineer who'd kept the wayward sun running when by all rights it should have fallen apart. She'd moved on to a better ship, a newer ship, one that didn't require constant maintenance and prayer to keep flying. Rowan didn't begrudge her the choice. Everyone had to do what made sense for them. There was Marcus, who'd been here at the Cantina every time Rowan passed through, who'd probably be here long after Rowan stopped traveling. There was Chen and their eternal project, their impossible dream. There was Yuki and her strange music that spoke to something deep and wordless inside. These were Rowan's people, or as close as they came to having people, scattered across the galaxy, connected by thin threads of memory and the occasional message. It wasn't much, maybe, but it was something. It was real. Looking back at it all, the jobs, the places, the people, Rowan felt something that took them a moment to identify. Not regret exactly, not pride either. Something quieter, more subtle. Acceptance maybe. The sense that this was their life, that they'd chosen it freely or as freely as anyone chose anything, and that it had been enough, was enough, would continue to be enough for as long as it lasted. Space was vast, yes, incomprehensibly so. You could spend a lifetime traveling and barely scratch the surface of what was out there. But that vastness didn't have to be lonely. It could be freeing instead. It could be possibility itself, stretched out before you like an open road, inviting you to see what was around the next corner, over the next horizon, in the next system. The ship waited outside, patient as always. The wayward sun, their home, their companion, their means of moving through the universe. It needed work, always needed work, but it was reliable in the ways that mattered. It would take Rowan wherever they needed to go, for as long as the engines held out, for as long as the journey continued. And the journey would continue. That was the one certainty. Tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. Rowan would climb back into the pilot's seat, fire up the engines, and point the ship towards somewhere new or somewhere old, somewhere they'd been before. It didn't matter much. The movement was the thing, the traveling itself rather than any particular destination. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, there was only this: the warm glow of the cantina, the taste of good whiskey, the soft sounds of conversation and music, the feeling of being somewhere safe for a few hours. Tonight, there was rest. Rowan raised their glass in a private toast to no one in particular, and drank. The night had deepened when Rowan finally pushed back from the bar. The cantina had grown quieter, the crowd thinning as people drifted off to wherever they were sleeping. Ships, rented rooms, the free bunks the port maintained for travelers who couldn't afford better. The music still played, but softer now, as if the jukebox itself was growing tired. Rowan nodded to Marcus, who nodded back. The same wordless exchange as always. No goodbyes, no see-you-laters, just the acknowledgement of one person by another. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the night air hit like cool water after a warm bath, shocking and welcome in equal measure. The temperature had dropped significantly. Rowan's breath came out in small clouds, visible in the light from the cantina windows. They pulled their jacket tighter and started back toward the port, following the same path they'd taken earlier, now lit only by the small solar lights and the enormous spread of stars overhead. Terminus had rotated in the sky, now lower on the horizon, its rings tilted at a different angle. New storms swirled across its surface, dark spots moving through the russet bands, systems that would rage for decades or centuries before eventually dissipating, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to the small moon orbiting below. The port was mostly deserted now, just a skeleton crew keeping watch, maintaining the essential systems that needed to run around the clock. The ships sat dark and silent on their pads, their occupants either asleep or absent. Rowan's boots echoed in the emptiness, each step sharp and clear in the cold air. Bay 7 came into view, and there was the wayward sun, exactly as Rowan had left it. They stopped for a moment, just looking at it, feeling that complicated mix of affection and exasperation that came from owning something that was simultaneously your greatest asset and your biggest liability. The ship needed attention. It always needed attention. Rowan approached the fueling station, an automated system that had been old when Rowan was young and was now approaching vintage status. They connected the fuel line to the ship's intake port, the coupling clicking home with a satisfying sound. The pump hummed to life, and through the transparent section of hose, they could see the fuel beginning to flow, thick and slightly luminescent. carrying the energy that would push the ship through hyperspace to the next destination. The sound was hypnotic, a steady hiss as the fuel moved through the line, the deeper thrum of the pump itself, the occasional clank as pressure changes rippled through the system. Rowan stood there, hands in pockets, watching the fuel level indicator on the pump slowly climb. 3/4 full, 7/8 full. The pump clicked off automatically, and the hissing stopped, leaving only the ambient sounds of the port, wind whistling through struts, the distant hum of the power plant, a security drone making its rounds somewhere overhead. Rowan disconnected the fuel line, securing it back in its housing. A few drops of fuel fell to the deck, glowing faintly before evaporating in the cold air. They sealed the ship's intake port, their movements automatic from years of practice. Next came the walk around, the ritual inspection that every pilot performed, even when they were tired, even when they wanted nothing more than to collapse into their bunk and sleep. Rowan moved slowly around the ship, checking each component, looking for anything that might cause problems. The port landing strut had that slight lean it had developed 2 months ago. Not critical, but something to keep an eye on. The starboard hull panel still showed the scorch marks from that close call near the asteroid belt. The metal darkened but not damaged. The communications array was intact, its dish pointed up at the stars, ready to catch signals from across the void. The engine panels were still warm to the touch, heat radiating off them in slow waves. Rowan placed their palm flat against the metal, feeling the warmth seep into their skin. The engines were the heart of the ship, ancient ion drives that were supposedly obsolete, but that somehow kept working year after year. They'd been rebuilt so many times that probably none of the original parts remained. The ship of Theseus paradox made manifest in metal and plasma. Status lights blinked on the exterior panels, green for systems nominal, yellow for the environmental recycler that had been running a bit rough lately but was still within acceptable parameters. Red would mean trouble, but there was no red tonight, just green and yellow, steady and reliable, telling Rowan that the ship was ready to fly when called upon. The hull creaked as it cooled, the metal contracting in the cold night air. It was a sound Rowan had heard 1,000 times, familiar as their own breathing. The ship settling, adjusting, finding equilibrium with its environment. It was alive in its way, as alive as a ship could be, and Rowan knew its moods, its quirks, its rhythms as well as they knew their own. Satisfied that everything was in order, or as much in order as it ever was, Rowan walked to the far side of the landing pad and sat down on a cargo crate that someone had left there. The metal was cold through their pants, but they didn't mind. They just wanted to sit for a while, to be still, to look at the sky. Terminus was rising again, or seemed to be. It was hard to tell if the gas giant was moving or if the moon's rotation was carrying it across the sky. Either way, it dominated the view, a rust-colored behemoth that filled 1/4 of the visible sky. The rings caught starlight and threw it back in silver arcs, beautiful and delicate despite their massive scale. The stars were incredible here, away from the light pollution of the inner systems. The Milky Way was a river of light, so dense with stars that you couldn't pick out individual ones, just the mass of them together. Billions of suns creating a luminous path across the darkness. Rowan picked out the constellations they knew, the ones that worked from this angle anyway. Navigation beacons blinked in the distance, satellites and stations marking their positions for any ships that might be passing through. This was the moment, the one Rowan came back for again and again. Not the cantina, not the whiskey, not the conversations with Chen, or the music from Yuki. Though those were all good things. But this, sitting alone in the cold night, watching the universe rotate overhead, feeling simultaneously insignificant and essential, small and infinite. In a few hours, the sun would rise, casting new light across the dusty landscape. People would wake, resume their routines, load and unload cargo, come and go. The port would fill with activity and purpose, but for now, it was still. Just Rowan and the ship and the stars and the sleeping universe. After a while, minutes or hours, it was hard to say. Rowan stood up, joints protesting slightly from the cold and the sitting. They gave the ship one last look, patting the hull like you'd pat an old friend's shoulder, then headed inside to sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough, but tonight had been perfect in its simple, quiet way, and that was enough. Rowan woke to the sound of the port coming alive, footsteps on metal decking, the whine of a loader moving cargo, voices calling to each other across the open spaces, the words indistinct, but the rhythm familiar, the language of work beginning for the day. They lay in their bunk for a few minutes, letting consciousness return gradually, feeling the ship around them. The wayward sun's life support hummed its constant song, a white noise that had become silence through familiarity. The air recycler clicked on, pushing fresh oxygen through the cabin. Somewhere in the engineering section, a relay switched, making a soft snapping sound that Rowan had never bothered to fix because it wasn't really broken, just noisy. Through the small porthole beside their bunk, sunlight streamed in, warm and golden. Driftmoon's sun was older than Earth's, slightly cooler, and it gave everything a gentler quality, like looking at the world through amber glass. Rowan watched dust motes dance in the beam of light, tumbling and spinning in the air currents, catching the light and releasing it. Eventually, they rose, moving through the morning routine with practiced efficiency. Splash water on the face from the ship's recycled supply, run fingers through hair, pull on yesterday's clothes because clean ones were a luxury saved for special occasions, drink water straight from the galley tap, slightly metallic but cold and good. The cargo manifest sat on the navigation console where Rowan had left it the night before. A simple job, really. Medical supplies for Kepler Station, 15 containers, all properly sealed and certified. Not particularly lucrative, but enough to cover fuel and food and maybe a little extra for the ship's endless need for repairs. 3 days in hyperspace, 2 days at Kepler to unload and pick up whatever return cargo was available. Then 3 days back. A standard run, the kind Rowan had made dozens of times before. They spent the morning on final preparations, checking the cargo straps to make sure everything was secured properly, running diagnostics on the hyperdrive, watching the numbers scroll across the screen, looking for anything that deviated from normal parameters, testing the communications array, sending a ping to the port control, and receiving the automated acknowledgement a few seconds later. By early afternoon, everything was ready. The ship was fueled, the cargo loaded and secured, all systems showing green. Rowan could leave immediately if they wanted, but they didn't want to, not quite yet. Instead, as the afternoon lengthened toward evening, they found themselves walking back toward the Cantina, drawn by something they couldn't quite name, habit maybe, or the simple human need for one more moment of connection before returning to the solitude of space. The Cantina in daylight was a different place, though no less welcoming. Sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the amber glass a deep honey color. The shadows that had given the space its mystery at night were gone, replaced by clarity, by the ability to see every detail, every weathered surface, every accumulated piece of history on the walls. Marcus was there, of course. Rowan suspected he lived in a room somewhere in the back, that he never really left, that the Cantina was less a business and more a calling, a purpose made manifest in salvaged metal and warm light. The usual drink appeared without being requested. Rowan sat at the bar, sipping slowly, savoring it. Around them, the Cantina held a handful of people, different faces than last night, but the same essential types. Travelers, workers, people passing through, people staying a while, people who'd somehow ended up here and never quite gotten around to leaving. Time passed in that fluid way it had here, measured not in minutes but in drinks, in conversations started and finished, in the slow arc of the sun across the sky visible through the western windows. Finally, as the light began to take on that golden quality that meant evening was approaching, Marcus spoke. "Last call," he said, his voice carrying easily through the space despite its quietness. It wasn't true last call, not the last call of the day. The cantina would stay open for hours yet. But it was Rowan's last call, their personal closing time. Marcus always seemed to know when someone was about to leave, when their time at Driftmoon was coming to an end. The lights dimmed slightly, responding to the fading sunlight outside, transitioning from day mode to evening mode. The cantina began its transformation back into the warm, amber-lit space it was at night, though the sun hadn't fully set yet. A few patrons stood, stretched, gathered their things and drifted toward the door. A woman in a pilot's jacket that had seen better days nodded to Rowan on her way out. A young couple who'd been sitting in the corner booth, holding hands across the table, rose and left together, their fingers still intertwined. An old man who'd been working on something at a corner table, Rowan couldn't see what, carefully packed his tools into a worn case and departed without a word to anyone. Rowan finished their drink, the last drops of whiskey warming their throat, and set the glass down gently on the bar. They reached into their pocket and produced a credit chip, placing it beside the glass. It was more than the drinks had cost, more than was necessary, but that was okay. This place had given them something more valuable than alcohol, something harder to quantify but essential nonetheless. Marcus picked up the chip, examined it briefly, then looked at Rowan and nodded. The nod said everything that needed saying. "Safe travels. Come back when you can. You're always welcome here." Rowan nodded back, the same wordless communication they'd been using since the first time they'd met, years ago. "Thanks, Marcus," Rowan said. "Anytime, Rowan," Marcus replied. They stood, and for a moment considered saying something more, something about what this place meant, about how it served as an anchor point in a life lived in motion. But the words wouldn't come, or maybe they weren't needed. Marcus understood. He'd heard it all before, from hundreds of travelers across the years. The cantina spoke for itself. Rowan walked to the door, pausing with their hand on the handle to look back one more time. The cantina looked the same as always, warm and welcoming, a constant in a changing universe. Marcus was already wiping down the bar, preparing for the evening crowd that would arrive soon. In the corner, someone new was sitting where Chen usually sat, bent over their own project, their own dream. Life continued, in its gentle, persistent way. Rowan pushed open the door and stepped out into the evening. The air was cool but not yet cold, that perfect temperature that wouldn't last. In an hour it would be frigid. But for now, it was exactly right. Above, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, like old friends arriving for a reunion. Terminus hung on the horizon, its rings glowing in the last light. The port lights flickered on, small fires kindled against the coming dark. Rowan took a deep breath, held it, released it slowly. Then they turned and started walking back toward Bay 7, toward the wayward sun, toward whatever came next. The wayward sun's engines warmed with their characteristic low hum, a sound that Rowan felt more than heard, a vibration that started in the soles of their feet and traveled up through their body. They sat in the pilot's seat, hands moving across the pre-flight checklist with muscle memory, checking each system in sequence, the ritual as familiar as breathing. Power plant, online. Life support, nominal. Navigation computer, calculating. Hyperdrive, charging. Everything green, everything ready. The ship eager to fly after its brief rest on the ground. Through the cockpit window, Rowan could see the port's control tower, its windows glowing in the gathering dusk. A routine clearance request, a routine response. "Wayward son, you are cleared for departure. Safe travels." The voice was tired but kind. Someone at the end of a long shift, still taking the time to wish a stranger well. "Acknowledged, Control. Thank you." Rowan's hand found the throttle, that worn metal lever that had been polished smooth by years of use. They pulled it back gently, and the engines responded, their hum rising in pitch, increasing in intensity. The landing struts groaned slightly under the changing forces, then released their grip on the pad with a series of soft clanks. The ship lifted, slowly, steadily, without urgency. The ground fell away beneath them, the port shrinking, the buildings becoming smaller, the lights becoming brighter as darkness deepened around them. Rowan could see the cantina, its windows glowing warm and amber, a beacon in the growing night. They wondered who was there now, what conversations were happening, what music Yuki might be playing. Life continuing, always continuing, flowing around and through each moment like water around stones. Higher now, and the curve of Driftmoon became visible, the moon revealing itself as the small world it was, a speck of rock and dust orbiting a gas giant, orbiting a star, orbiting the galactic core in a dance that had been going on for billions of years and would continue for billions more. The lights of the port became a small constellation, then a cluster of stars, then individual points of light that gradually merged and faded into the greater darkness. Driftmoon itself began to recede, its rust-colored surface blending with the shadows, until it was just another object in space, just another moon among countless moons. But Rowan would remember it, would carry it with them, another layer added to the accumulation of places and moments that made up a life. Driftmoon would be there, in memory, whenever they needed it. The cool evening air, the warm cantina, the taste of good whiskey, the sound of Yuki's strange instrument, the understanding in Marcus's nod. All of it preserved, all of it real, even as the physical place grew smaller and more distant in the viewport. The navigation computer chimed softly, indicating it had finished calculating the hyperspace jump to Kepler Station. Rowan glanced at the numbers, verified they looked correct, made a small adjustment to account for the local gravity well. Everything in order, everything ready, but not quite yet, not. Instead of engaging the hyperdrive, Rowan eased back on the throttle, letting the ship settle into a gentle cruise, moving through open space at a speed that was barely movement at all. They were in no rush. The cargo would wait. Kepler Station would wait. Everything could wait for just a little while longer. Through the viewport, the universe spread out in all its impossible glory, stars beyond counting, each one a sun with its own story, its own family of worlds, its own possibility. Nebulae glowed in the distance, vast clouds of gas and dust lit from within by newborn stars. Galaxies wheeled in their slow dance. So far away, their light had taken millions of years to arrive, showing Rowan a past that no longer existed, but was real nonetheless in its way. The ship's hull creaked and settled, adjusting to the microgravity, to the slight acceleration. The vibration of the engines was steady, reliable, a heartbeat that had never stopped since Rowan had first powered them up all those years ago. The life support hummed its quiet song, cycling air, maintaining temperature, creating the small bubble of habitability that allowed a human to exist in the vast inhospitability of space. Rowan's breathing synchronized with the ship, slow and steady, in and out, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the engines, the flicker of the instrument panels, the rotation of the cosmos itself. Their heartbeat slowed, settled, found its resting pace. Their muscles released tensions they hadn't known they were holding, unwinding gradually like springs that had been compressed for too long. This was the moment they lived for, the one that made all the rest worthwhile. Not the arrival, not the departure, but this liminal space between them, this pause in the endless motion, floating in the black, held by nothing, surrounded by everything, at peace with the journey and whatever it might bring. Behind them, Driftmoon continued to recede, its lights fading, finally disappearing entirely. Ahead, the stars beckoned, infinite and patient, offering their own silent welcome. The route to Kepler was laid in, the path clear, the destination certain. But for now, there was only this, the quiet hum of the ship, the steady stars sliding past, the vast and gentle dark. Rowan closed their eyes, just for a moment, just to feel it fully, the ship, the space, the motion that was also stillness, the solitude that was also connection, the endless journey that was also, somehow, home. When they opened their eyes again, nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The universe still turned, the ship still flew, the stars still watched. But something had settled inside, some question answered without ever being asked, some need met without ever being acknowledged. Rowan's hand moved to the hyperdrive controls, but slowly, without urgency. There would be time enough for speed, for the rush of faster-than-light travel, for the compression of space and the bending of time, but not yet, not quite yet. For now, there was only the slow cruise through open space, the engines maintaining their steady vibration, the hull creaking softly as temperature gradients worked across its surface, the recycled air moving through the vents with its faint mechanical whisper, the stars, infinite and ancient, casting their light across the dark. The ship drifted on, carrying its single passenger through the cosmic ocean, a mote of consciousness in the void, simultaneously insignificant and precious beyond measure. The viewport framed infinity, and Rowan watched it pass, or perhaps they passed through it. It was hard to say which was moving and which was still, or if that distinction even mattered. Breathing, in and out, slow and steady, the rhythm of being alive, of existing, of continuing despite and because of everything. The stars slid past, patient as always, waiting as they'd waited for eons, as they'd wait for eons more. Time ceased to have meaning. Distance became irrelevant. There was only this eternal moment, this perpetual now, stretching out in all directions, infinite and infinitely peaceful. Somewhere in the ship's systems, a relay clicked. The environmental computer made a minor adjustment, responding to data that only it understood. The hull creaked again, that familiar sound, like an old house settling for the night. Rowan settled deeper into the pilot's seat, feeling its contours, worn to fit their body through years of use. Their eyes grew heavy, lids drifting closed, then opening again, then closing, the boundary between waking and sleeping becoming porous, permeable, until it hardly existed at all. The ship knew the way. The computer had the coordinates. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. There was nothing to do but drift and dream and let the journey continue at its own gentle pace. The universe, wide and calm, held them in its embrace. The black between the stars was not empty but full of possibility, full of peace, full of the quiet promise that wherever this path led, it would be enough. It would be right. And so, the wayward sun cruised on through the darkness, its pilot at rest, its engines humming their steady song, carrying its small burden of dreams and cargo toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The stars watched. The ship flew. And in the infinite, patient dark, everything was exactly as it should be. Peaceful. Perfect. Still.